I still remember the day the lawyer read my parents' will. I was sitting in that cold office, the smell of old paper and coffee filling the air, and my brother Marcus was next to me, his expensive cologne making me slightly nauseous. We hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since Dad's 70th birthday party, when he told me I was wasting my life working as a kindergarten teacher instead of pursuing something more prestigious like him. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Henderson with thick glasses and a voice that sounded like he'd been smoking for 40 years, cleared his throat and began reading. Mr. Henderson said, "To my son Marcus Jonathan Fletcher, I leave the family estate at 23 Maple Ridge Drive, including all furnishings, the 3 vehicles in the garage, and the sum of $400,000 for my investment portfolio." I watched Marcus nod, a small satisfied smile playing on his lips. Of course he got the mansion. The house where we grew up, with its 6 bedrooms, the swimming pool, the tennis court, the gardens that Mom had tended with such love before the cancer took her 5 years ago. Mr. Henderson continued, "To my daughter Elena Marie Fletcher, I leave the property at 47 Willow Creek Road." I blinked. I didn't even know my parents owned another property. I looked at Marcus, but he just shrugged, equally confused. Mr. Henderson added, "Additionally, Elena will receive the sum of $12,000 to assist with any necessary repairs." $12,000? My brother got $400,000 and a mansion. I got $12,000 and some mystery property I'd never heard of. Marcus actually laughed. He said well, at least you got something, right? I didn't respond. I just sat there, feeling that familiar sting of being the lesser child, the overlooked one, the daughter who could never quite measure up to her brilliant older brother with his law degree and his corner office and his perfect wife and his perfect children. After the reading, Mr. Henderson handed me an envelope. Inside was a single key and a photograph of a house that made my heart sink into my stomach. It was small, maybe 900 square feet, with peeling paint, a sagging porch, broken windows, and what looked like a tree growing through part of the roof. The yard was completely overgrown, weeds as tall as my waist choking what might have once been a garden. Mr. Henderson said, "Your father purchased this property about 30 years ago. To my knowledge, no one has lived there in at least 25 years. He never explained why he kept it." I drove out to see it the next day. It was about 40 minutes from the city, in a small town called Millbrook. That time seemed to have forgotten. The house was even worse in person than in the photograph. The photograph must have been taken years ago because now there were 2 trees growing through the roof. The porch had partially collapsed, and I could see animals had made their homes in various parts of the structure. I sat in my car and cried. I cried for 20 minutes straight, ugly sobs that shook my whole body. I was 34 years old, recently divorced, working a job I loved, but that barely paid the bills. And now my dead father's final message to me was this crumbling disaster of a house. When I finally stopped crying, I called my best friend Delia. She answered on the second ring. Delia said, "Hey girl, how did the will reading go?" I told her everything, my voice still shaky from crying. There was a long pause. Then Delia said, "So what are you going to do?" I looked at the house again. A piece of the gutter chose that exact moment to fall off and crash to the ground. I said, "I have no idea." Delia said, "Well, you could sell it. Land's got to be worth something even if the house is a total loss." I should have. That would have been the sensible thing to do. But something stopped me. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the fact that this was the only thing my father had left me, and I wanted to understand why. Maybe it was the fact that my lease was up in 2 months, and I couldn't afford the rent increase my landlord was demanding. I said, "I think I'm going to fix it up." Delia laughed, then realized I was serious. She said, "Elena, honey, that house needs to be demolished, not fixed." I said, "Maybe, but I'm going to try." The first week was overwhelming. I took time off work and drove out to Millbrook every day, just trying to assess the damage. The house had been beautiful once, I could tell. It was a craftsman bungalow, built in the 1920s according to the county records. It had original hardwood floors under the layers of dirt and debris, built-in bookshelves in what had been the living room, a fireplace with hand-painted tiles. But the damage was extensive. The roof was completely gone in 2 places. Water damage had destroyed most of the upstairs. The plumbing was rusted through. The electrical system was ancient and dangerous. Animals had been living in the walls for decades. I made a list of everything that needed to be done. It filled 3 pages of a legal pad. I called Marcus that night, not really knowing why. Maybe I wanted him to tell me I was crazy. Maybe I wanted him to offer to help. I don't know what I expected. Marcus said, "You're actually going to try to fix that dump?" I said, "Yes." He laughed. Not a kind laugh. He said, "Elena, you've never been good with your hands. Remember when you tried to put together that bookshelf from the furniture store and it fell apart the first time you put a book on it?" I remembered. I also remembered that I was 22 and had just moved into my first apartment, and he had refused to help me even though he lived 10 minutes away. I said, "I'm going to figure it out." Marcus said, "Waste of time and money if you ask me. But hey, it's your inheritance, such as it is." I hung up without saying goodbye. The next day, I started. I didn't know what I was doing, but I started anyway. I bought work gloves, trash bags, a mask, and I began clearing out the debris. It took me 4 days just to fill the dumpster I had rented with broken furniture, rotted wood, and 30 years of accumulated garbage. On the 5th day, I was pulling up ruined carpet in what had been the bedroom when I found the first one. A small wooden box, hidden under a loose floorboard. My heart was pounding as I opened it. Inside was a stack of letters, tied together with a faded blue ribbon, and a photograph of a woman I had never seen before, holding a baby. The letters were addressed to my father. The return address was this house. I sat on the dusty floor for a long time, staring at that photograph. The woman was beautiful, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold some deep sadness, even as she smiled at the camera. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old. The first letter was dated 32 years ago. It began, "My dearest Robert, I know we agreed this was for the best, but I can't stop thinking about what might have been. I read all 18 letters that night, sitting on the floor of that ruined house with a flashlight because the electricity wasn't working. By the time I finished, tears were streaming down my face. Her name was Maria Santos. She had been my father's secretary at his accounting firm 33 years ago. They had fallen in love, she had gotten pregnant, and because my father was already married to my mother, because he was a respected member of the community, because it was a different time, they had made a decision. He had bought her this house. He had set up a trust fund for the child. And he had walked away, visiting only a handful of times over the years, always in secret. I had a sister. Somewhere out there, I had a half-sister named Isabella, who was 32 years old and who I had never known existed. The last letter was different from the others. It was from a lawyer, dated 15 years ago, informing my father that Maria Santos had passed away from a sudden illness, and that Isabella, then 17, had been placed in foster care because there were no other relatives. The trust fund had been depleted years earlier, when Maria had used it for medical bills during an earlier illness. I sat there in the dark, trying to process everything I had just learned. My father, the man I had idolized as a child, the man whose approval I had spent my entire life seeking, had abandoned a child, had let her grow up without a father, had let her end up in foster care rather than acknowledge her existence. I thought about all the times he had criticized me for not being good enough, not successful enough, not accomplished enough. And all that time, he had been carrying this secret. This shame. I didn't know what to feel. Anger, certainly. Sadness. Confusion. But also something else. Something that surprised me. Determination. I was going to find Isabella. And I was going to fix this house. The house our father had given to her mother. The house that should have been filled with love but had been abandoned just like Isabella herself. I started the next morning with renewed energy. I called every contractor in Millbrook, but most of them either didn't return my calls or told me the house wasn't worth saving. Finally, I found a woman named Rosa Martinez, a general contractor who had been working in the area for 20 years. Rosa came out to look at the property. She walked through every room, poking at walls, checking foundations, climbing up a ladder to examine the roof. I followed her nervously, preparing myself for her to tell me to tear the whole thing down. Instead, she said, "It's got good bones." I said, "Really?" Rosa said, "The foundation is solid. Most of the original structure is sound. It's going to be a lot of work, but it can be saved. Question is, do you want to do most of the work yourself and save money, or hire out everything and spend more?" I thought about my $12,000. I thought about my kindergarten teacher salary. I thought about my brother and his $400,000 inheritance. I said, I want to learn. I want to do as much as I can myself. Rosa looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. She said, I like that. Most people want the easy way. I'll teach you what I can, and we'll hire specialists for the electrical and plumbing. Deal? We shook hands. The next few months were the hardest of my life. I was working full-time at the kindergarten during the week, then driving to Millbrook every weekend and spending every spare moment at the house. I learned to tear out drywall and put up new drywall. I learned to lay tile. I learned to sand and refinish hardwood floors. I learned what a load-bearing wall was and why you shouldn't knock one down without knowing what you're doing. I made mistakes. So many mistakes. I put a nail through a water pipe and flooded the kitchen. I installed a window upside down and had to take it out and do it again. I cut a piece of trim 4 times and it was still too short. Rosa was patient with me. She said, everyone makes mistakes. The difference between a good worker and a bad one is whether you learn from them. I was learning. Slowly, painfully, but learning. During this time, I was also searching for Isabella. It wasn't easy. Foster care records are confidential. The lawyer who had written that final letter had retired and moved to Arizona. Maria's family, what little I could find of them, had lost touch with Isabella years ago. But I didn't give up. I hired a private investigator named Janet Chen, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, who had spent 20 years as a police detective before going private. Janet said, I have to be honest with you. Cases like this, sometimes we find the person in a week. Sometimes we never find them. Are you prepared for either outcome? I said, I have to try. She nodded. She said, then I'll do my best. While Janet searched, I kept working on the house. Spring turned to summer, and the house slowly began to transform. We got the roof fixed first, stopping the water damage. Then we tackled the electrical, bringing everything up to code. The plumbing came next, new pipes running through the walls like the house's circulatory system being renewed. I was there almost every weekend, covered in sawdust or paint or both, working until my muscles screamed and my back ached. Delia came to help sometimes, though she was mostly moral support, bringing me food and keeping me company while I worked. Delia said, I have to admit, I didn't think you could do this. I was on my hands and knees, laying tile in the bathroom. I said, I didn't either. She said, so why are you doing it? Really? It can't just be about the money, because you've already spent more than you would have gotten selling the land. I sat back on my heels, thinking about her question. I said, I found something here. Not just the letters. I found out who I really am. Or maybe who I can be. My whole life, everyone told me what I couldn't do. My dad, Marcus, even my ex-husband. I started to believe them. But out here, working on this house, I'm proving them wrong. I'm proving myself wrong. Delia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's really beautiful, Elena." I said, "Plus, I really want to see Marcus's face when I'm done." She laughed. She said, "There she is. There's the petty queen I know and love." In August, Janet called me with news. Janet said, "I found her. Isabella Santos. She goes by Izzy now. She's living in Portland, Oregon. Works as a social worker specializing in foster youth. Never married, no kids." My hands were shaking. I said, "Do you have contact information?" Janet said, "I have her work address and email. But Elena, I have to warn you, I did some digging. She knows about your father. She found out when she was in foster care, did her own research. She tried to contact him once, about 10 years ago. He never responded." I closed my eyes. Of course he didn't. Of course my father, the man who preached about integrity and responsibility my entire childhood, had ignored his own daughter when she reached out to him. I said, "Thank you, Janet. Send me everything you have." I didn't contact Isabella right away. I needed time to figure out what to say. How do you reach out to a sister you never knew existed? How do you apologize for a father's sins? How do you bridge 3 decades of absence? I decided to write a letter. It seemed fitting, given how I had learned about her existence. I sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours, writing and rewriting. I wrote, "Dear Isabella, my name is Elena Fletcher, and I recently learned that we share a father. I know this letter might be unwelcome, and I would understand completely if you choose not to respond. But I wanted you to know that I found the house on Willow Creek Road, the house he bought for your mother. I'm fixing it up, and I found your mother's letters. I know this doesn't make up for anything, doesn't undo any of the hurt you must have experienced. But I wanted you to know that someone in this family knows the truth now. Someone cares. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Your sister, Elena." I mailed the letter and tried not to check my email every 5 minutes, waiting for a response. 2 weeks passed. Nothing. 3 weeks. Nothing. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I had expected this. I told myself I had done what I could. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. The area code was Portland. A woman's voice said, "Is this Elena?" I said, "Yes." There was a long pause. Then she said, "This is Izzy, Isabella. I got your letter." I couldn't speak. My throat was tight with emotion. She said, "I have to be honest, I almost threw it away without reading it. I spent a lot of years being angry at that family." "Your family?" "Our family, I guess." I said, "I understand. I would be angry too." She said, "But something made me read it, and then I read it again, and I've been thinking about it ever since." I waited, afraid to say the wrong thing. She said, "Tell me about the house. Tell me about what you found." So I told her. I told her about the will, about Marcus getting the mansion while I got the wreck. I told her about deciding to fix it up, about learning everything from scratch, about Rosa teaching me to use power tools and lay tile. I told her about finding the letters, about reading them all in one night, about crying on that dusty floor. She was quiet while I talked. When I finished, she said, "My mother loved that house. She used to tell me stories about it when I was little, about the garden she planted, about the swing on the porch. She always said that one day, when things were different, we'd go back there." I said, "The garden is coming back. I've been clearing the weeds, and some of the plants she put in are still alive. There's a rose bush by the front porch that's blooming again." Isabella was crying. I could hear it in her voice when she said, "I want to see it, the house. I want to see what you're doing with it." I said, "Come anytime. It's your house as much as mine. More than mine, really." She said, "I can fly out next month. Would that work?" I said, "That would be perfect." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. A cruel inheritance that had turned into something else entirely. A father's secret that had connected 2 sisters who should have known each other their whole lives. The next few weeks, I worked harder than ever on the house. I wanted it to be as beautiful as possible when Isabella arrived. I finished the bathroom tile. I painted the living room a soft sage green. I fixed the front porch, rebuilding it from scratch with Rosa's help, and hung a new swing where the old one had rotted away. I even started working on the garden. I had never gardened before, had never had the space or the patience, but I found myself spending hours out there, pulling weeds, nurturing the plants that had survived decades of neglect, planting new things alongside the old. My neighbor in Millbrook, an elderly man named Frank who had lived next door for 50 years, came over one day to watch me work. Frank said, "You know, I remember when this house was full of life. Young woman with a little girl, lived here for about 8 years before she got sick and had to move to be closer to the hospital in the city." I stood up, wiping dirt from my hands. I said, "You remember them? Maria and Isabella?" Frank said, "Sure, sweet people. The little girl used to come over and help my wife with her garden. She had a real gift for growing things." I felt tears pricking at my eyes. I said, "Isabella is coming to visit next month. She's going to see the house again." Frank smiled. He said, "That's good. That's real good. This house has been waiting a long time for someone to love it again." The day Isabella arrived, I was a nervous wreck. I picked her up at the airport and we stood there in the arrivals area just looking at each other for a long moment. She looked like the photograph of her mother, the same dark hair, the same eyes that held joy and sadness in equal measure. Isabella said, "I can't believe we're finally meeting." I said, "I know. I feel like I should hug you, but I don't know if that's okay." She laughed, and suddenly she was hugging me, and we were both crying right there in the middle of the airport with travelers flowing around us like a river around two stones. The drive to Millbrook was 2 hours, and we talked the entire time. She told me about growing up with her mother, about the happy years before Maria got sick, about the foster homes after, some good and some terrible. She told me about working her way through college, about becoming a social worker because she wanted to help kids like her, kids who fell through the cracks of the system. I told her about growing up in Marcus's shadow, about always feeling like I wasn't enough, about my marriage falling apart because my ex-husband thought I was too soft, too idealistic, not ambitious enough. Isabella said, "It sounds like we both spent a lot of time feeling like we didn't belong." I said, "Maybe that's why we're supposed to find each other now." When we pulled up to the house, Isabella gasped. She said, "Elena, it's beautiful." And it was. The new paint gleamed in the afternoon sun. The porch was sturdy and welcoming with the new swing. The windows sparkled. The garden was blooming with roses and lavender and herbs. I said, "It's not finished yet. Still a lot of work to do inside, but it's getting there." We walked through together. I showed her the living room with its restored built-in bookshelves, the fireplace with the hand-painted tiles that I had carefully cleaned and preserved. I showed her the kitchen with its new cabinets and old-fashioned farmhouse sink that I had found at a salvage yard. I showed her the bedroom where I had found her mother's letters. Isabella stood in that room for a long time. She said, "I can feel her here. Is that strange?" I said, "No, I don't think so." She said, "She used to sing to me in this room." Spanish lullabies that her mother taught her. I still remember the words. We spent 3 days together at the house. We worked side by side, painting and cleaning and fixing small things. We talked for hours, filling in the gaps of 3 decades, learning each other's histories and hopes and fears. On the second night, we sat on the porch swing with glasses of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. Isabella said, "What are you going to do with the house when it's finished?" I had been thinking about this. I said, "I want you to have it." She turned to look at me. She said, "Elena, I can't take this from you." "You've put so much work into it." I said, "It was your mother's house. It should have been yours all along. Our father took so much from you. This is the only thing I can give back." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What if we shared it? What if it was ours, both of ours? A place we could both come to, a place that belongs to both of us?" I felt something warm spread through my chest. I said, "I would like that." Isabella stayed for a week total, and by the time she left, I felt like I had known her my whole life. We made plans for her to come back at Christmas, to help me finish the last of the renovations, to spend the holidays together in the house that had connected us. After she left, I threw myself back into the work with even more energy. I finished the second bedroom, turning it into a cozy guest room for when Isabella visited. I refinished the hardwood floors throughout the house, spending 3 weekends on my hands and knees with a sander, learning the grain of the wood and the patience required to bring out its natural beauty. I also did something I had been putting off for months. I called Marcus. He answered with his usual condescension. "Well, well, little sister." "Finally ready to admit defeat on that disaster of a house?" I said, "Actually, I'm calling to invite you to see it. It's almost done." There was a long pause. Marcus said, "You actually fixed it?" I said I did, with a lot of help and a lot of hard work. And I think you should see it. I think you should see what Dad left me. And hear what I found there. He agreed to come, more out of curiosity than anything else, I think. He couldn't imagine that I had actually accomplished something he thought was impossible. The day he arrived, I was ready. The house was gleaming, every surface clean, every repair complete. The garden was in full bloom. The fall sun made the whole property look like something from a magazine. Marcus pulled up in his expensive car and sat there for a moment, just staring. When he got out, his face was unreadable. He said, "This doesn't look like the same house." I said, "It took 8 months of work, but yes, same house." I gave him the tour. He was quiet the whole time, running his hand over the restored woodwork, examining the tile I had laid, looking at the garden through the new windows. Finally, he said, "I didn't think you could do this." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "Elena, I need to tell you something. I need to apologize." I waited. He said, "I've spent our whole lives treating you like you were less than me, like you weren't as smart, weren't as capable, weren't as worthy of respect, and I was wrong. What you've done here, it's remarkable. It's more than I could have done." I felt tears threatening, but I blinked them back. I said, "Thank you, Marcus. That means a lot." He said, "There's more. When Dad was dying, he told me something. He told me he was leaving you this house for a reason. He said he had made mistakes in his life, terrible mistakes, and he hoped that you would be the one to fix them." I didn't understand what he meant then. I think I do now. I said, "You know about Isabella." His face went pale. He said, "How do you know about Isabella?" I said, "I found letters, her mother's letters to Dad. I found her, Marcus. I've been getting to know her. She's our sister, and she's wonderful, and Dad abandoned her." Marcus sat down heavily on the new porch swing. He said, "He told me about her when I was 25, made me promise never to tell anyone. I've kept that secret for 15 years. I said, That was wrong of him to ask. That was wrong of you to agree. He said, I know that now. I idolized him, you know? I wanted to be just like him. Finding out he was capable of something like that, it broke something in me. I think I've spent the last 15 years trying to pretend it never happened. I sat down next to him on the swing. I said, Isabella wants to meet you. She's forgiven Dad, as much as she can. I think she could forgive you too, if you gave her the chance. Marcus was crying. I had never seen my brother cry before, not even at our mother's funeral, not even at our father's. He said, I don't deserve forgiveness. I said, none of us deserve anything, but we can try to do better. That's all any of us can do. He stayed for dinner that night. We sat at the small table I had refinished, eating takeout because I still didn't have a working stove, talking about things we had never talked about before. Our childhoods, our parents, the ways we had hurt each other, and the ways we might heal. Before he left, he wrote a check and tried to hand it to me. Marcus said, for the house, for everything you've done. I didn't take it. I said, I don't want your money. I want my brother back. I want us to be a real family, not competitors. Can you give me that? He put the check away. He said, I can try. Christmas that year was the best I could remember. Isabella flew in from Portland. Marcus came with his wife and kids, who I had barely known before. We all crowded into the little house on Willow Creek Road, sleeping on air mattresses and the fold-out couch, cooking together in the tiny kitchen, laughing and crying and beginning to heal the wounds that had been festering for so long. On Christmas morning, we all gathered in the living room. I had a fire going in the restored fireplace. The kids were playing with their new toys. The adults were drinking coffee and watching the snow fall outside the new windows. Isabella said, I have an announcement. Everyone turned to look at her. She said, I've been offered a job, a really good job, at a nonprofit in the city, working with foster youth, and I've decided to take it. I felt my heart leap. I said, You're moving here? She smiled. She said, I'm moving here. I was thinking maybe I could stay at the house while I look for an apartment, if that's okay with my sister. I hugged her so hard I probably bruised her ribs. Marcus cleared his throat. He said, I have an announcement too. We all looked at him. He said, I've been thinking a lot about what Elena said about being a real family. And I realized that I've been holding on to Dad's secret for too long. I've been holding on to a lot of things for too long. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He said, Dad left more than what was in the will. He had a separate account, one that was supposed to go to Isabella. But when the lawyer couldn't find her 15 years ago, the money reverted to the estate. To me, he handed the envelope to Isabella. He said, This is what you should have had all along. It's not enough to make up for everything, but it's a start. Isabella opened the envelope. I could see her hands shaking. She said, Marcus, this is $200,000. He said, It was supposed to be yours. I'm sorry it took so long. Isabella was crying. She said, I don't know what to say. Marcus said, You don't have to say anything. Just know that you have a family now. A weird, broken, trying to do better family. But a family. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, looking at the fire dying in the fireplace. I thought about where I had been a year ago, crying in my car outside a ruined house, feeling like a failure, like the afterthought I had always believed I was. I thought about everything that had happened since. The work, the sweat, the aching muscles and blistered hands, finding Isabella, reconnecting with Marcus, learning that I was capable of so much more than I had ever believed. I thought about my father, who I would never be able to fully understand. A man who had done terrible things but had also, in his own flawed way, tried to make amends at the end. leaving me this house, with its secrets waiting to be discovered. Trusting me to do what he couldn't, to bring the family back together, to fix what he had broken. I didn't forgive him. I wasn't sure I ever could. But I could take the gift he had given me and make something good from it. The house creaked around me, settling into the cold night, but it was a good sound now, a sound of life and warmth and shelter. A home. My phone buzzed. A text from Delia. "Merry Christmas, home renovation queen. How's the family reunion going?" I smiled and texted back, "Better than I ever could have imagined. I think I finally found where I belong." She sent back a string of heart emojis. I put down my phone and watched the last embers of the fire glow orange in the darkness. A year ago, I had been given a wreck of a house and a seemingly impossible task. I had been given the crumbs while my brother got the feast. I had been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. But what I had found in that wreck was so much more than real estate. I had found a sister. I had found reconciliation with my brother. I had found strength I didn't know I had. I had found a purpose beyond just surviving, beyond just getting by. I had found myself. The house had been broken, abandoned, forgotten, just like Isabella, just like, in many ways, me. But we had both been rebuilt. We had both been restored. We had both found that what looks like nothing, what looks like a burden, can become the greatest gift of all. When I started fixing up that house, I thought I was just doing repairs, replacing rotten wood, laying tile, painting walls. I didn't realize I was fixing something much bigger. I was fixing a family. I was fixing the mistakes of the past. I was fixing my own broken belief in myself. And in the end, that's what I found hidden in the walls of that crumbling house. Not treasure, not money, not anything that could be measured or counted. I found the truth. I found connection. I found the kind of love that survives even when everything around it falls apart. I found home. The next morning, I woke up early, before anyone else. I made coffee and walked out onto the porch, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. The snow had stopped during the night, and everything was covered in white, clean and fresh and new. Isabella came out a few minutes later, wrapped in a blanket. Isabella said, "Couldn't sleep either?" I said, "Too much to think about." She stood next to me, looking out at the garden buried under snow. She said, "My mother would have loved to see this, to see the house like this, to see us together like this." I said, "I think she knows. Somehow I think she knows." Isabella said, "Do you believe that? That people who are gone can still know what's happening?" I thought about it. I said, "I don't know what I believe about what happens after we die, but I believe that love doesn't just disappear. I believe that the love your mother had for you, the love she put into this house and this garden, it's still here. It's part of the walls, part of the soil, part of you." Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Part of us." I smiled. I said, "Part of us." We stood there together, watching the sun rise over the snow-covered garden, two sisters who had found each other against all odds, in a house that had been abandoned but never forgotten, broken but never beyond repair. Just like us. Just like all of us. When I started this journey, I thought I had been given the worst possible inheritance. A wreck of a house while my brother got the mansion, a burden instead of a blessing. But I had been given exactly what I needed. I had been given a reason to discover who I really was. I had been given a path to find my sister. I had been given an opportunity to rebuild not just a house, but an entire family, and I had taken it. Despite every doubt, every obstacle, every voice telling me I couldn't do it, I had taken it and transformed it into something beautiful. That's what I found when I started fixing up that wreck of a house. I found that sometimes, the things that look like curses are actually blessings in disguise. I found that hard work and determination can accomplish what seems impossible. I found that secrets have a way of coming to light. And that light, even when it reveals painful truths, is always better than darkness. I found that family is not just about blood, but about choice, about showing up, about doing the hard work of loving people even when it's difficult. And I found that I was so much stronger, so much more capable, so much more worthy than I had ever believed. That crumbling house became my teacher. Those rotting walls became my classroom. Every repair I made to the structure was a repair I was making to my own sense of self. Now, standing on the porch of a beautiful restored home, with my sister beside me and my family inside, I finally understood why my father had left me this house. Not as a punishment, not as an afterthought, as a gift. A gift of transformation, a gift of discovery, a gift of becoming who I was always meant to be. The house had been waiting 30 years for someone to love it again, and I had been waiting 34 years to find out that I was capable of love this big, this transformative, this healing. We had found each other just in time. And together we had created something neither of us could have created alone. A home, a family, a future. That's what I found when I started fixing up that wreck of a house. And it was worth every splinter, every aching muscle, every moment of doubt. It was worth everything. Isabella squeezed my hand. Isabella said, "Thank you for not giving up, on the house, on finding me, on any of it." I squeezed back. I said, "Thank you for giving me a chance, for not throwing away that letter." She laughed softly. She said, "Best decision I ever made." I said, "Mine too." Behind us, we could hear the others starting to wake up. Marcus's kids were laughing about something. Someone was making noise in the kitchen. The house was filling with the sounds of life, of family, of love. Isabella said, "So what's next? You've conquered home renovation. What other impossible things are you going to do?" I thought about it. I said, "I don't know yet, but whatever it is, I know now that I can do it, that I can do anything, as long as I'm willing to try." She nodded. She said, "That's the thing about rebuilding. Once you've done it once, you know you can do it again. Whatever breaks, whatever falls apart, you know you have the strength to put it back together." I looked at my sister, at this woman who had survived abandonment and foster care and years of uncertainty, who had turned her pain into purpose by helping other kids like her who had found the courage to reach out to a family that had failed her. I said, "You taught me that. Before I even met you, your story taught me that. Finding out about you, about what you had overcome, it gave me strength when I didn't think I had any left." Isabella's eyes were bright with tears. She said, "And you gave me something I'd given up hope of ever having. A family, a home, a place where I belong." I said, "You always belonged here. This house, this family, it was always waiting for you. It just took us a while to find each other." She said, "Better late than never." I said, "So much better." The sun was fully up now, sparkling off the snow, making everything look fresh and clean and full of possibility. A new day, a new year coming soon, a new chapter in all of our lives. I had started this journey looking for a reason why my father had given me a wreck of a house. I had ended it with so much more than I ever could have imagined. A sister, a rebuilt relationship with my brother, a home that was truly mine, that I had created with my own two hands, a sense of purpose and capability that I had never known before, and most importantly, a knowledge that I was enough. That I had always been enough. That all the voices telling me I couldn't, I wasn't, I shouldn't, had been wrong. I was strong. I was capable. I was worthy of love and respect, and a place in this world. And I had found all of that in the walls of a crumbling house that everyone else had given up on, including, once upon a time, me, but not anymore. Never again. Now I knew what I was made of, and I couldn't wait to find out what else I could build. 3 months later, the house was officially complete. I held a small celebration, just close friends and family. Delia came, of course, and Rosa, who had become like a second mother to me over those long months of work. Frank from next door came too, along with a few other neighbors who had watched the transformation happen. Isabella was there, already settled into her new job and loving it. Marcus came with his family, and for the first time in our lives, we actually felt like siblings instead of competitors. I gave a little speech, standing on the front porch that I had rebuilt with my own hands. I said, "A year ago, I thought this house was the worst thing that could have happened to me. I thought my father was punishing me one last time, reminding me that I would never be good enough. But I was wrong. This house taught me who I really am. It taught me that I'm stronger than I ever knew. It gave me a sister I never knew I had. It gave me my brother back. It gave me a purpose." I paused, looking at all the faces gathered in the garden that Maria Santos had planted so many years ago. I said, "But more than anything, it taught me that the things that seem broken beyond repair usually aren't. Houses, families, ourselves. We can always be rebuilt. We can always start again." We just have to be willing to do the work. Everyone clapped, and I felt tears streaming down my face. But they were happy tears, grateful tears, the tears of someone who had finally found her place in the world. Later that night, after everyone else had gone home, Isabella and I sat on the porch swing one more time. The stars were out, more stars than I had ever seen in the city, and the night was warm and soft. Isabella said, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" She said, "All those years I was angry at our father, all those years I wished things had been different, and now I'm almost grateful." If he had been part of my life, if things had gone the way they were supposed to, I might never have become who I am. I might never have found my calling helping foster kids. I might never have become strong enough to survive on my own. I nodded slowly. I said, "And if he had given me the mansion instead of this house, I would still be living in Marcus's shadow." I would still think I couldn't do anything. I would still be that scared little girl trying to earn approval I was never going to get. Isabella said, "So maybe he knew. Maybe he knew exactly what he was doing." I said, "Maybe. Or maybe it was just luck. Maybe the universe knew what we needed even if he didn't." She smiled. She said, "Either way, I'm glad it happened. All of it. Even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts." I said, "Me too." We sat there in comfortable silence, listening to the crickets and the wind in the trees, feeling the presence of all the people who had loved this house before us, all the stories that had unfolded within these walls. I said, "You know, Rosa told me something when we first started working on the house. She said every old house has stories to tell, secrets hidden in the walls and the floorboards. You just have to be patient enough to listen." Isabella said, "What do you think this house was trying to tell us?" I thought about it for a long time. I said, "I think it was telling us that love endures." Even when people fail us, even when families fall apart, even when everything seems lost, love finds a way to survive. Your mother loved you enough to write those letters, to keep hoping that someday things would be different. Our father, in his flawed and inadequate way, loved you enough to keep this house, to leave it to someone who might find the truth. And now we're here, carrying that love forward, making something new from all those broken pieces. Isabella was crying softly. She said, "That's beautiful." I said, "It's just the truth." "The truth I found when I started fixing up this house." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we stayed like that for a long time. Two sisters who had found each other against all odds, sitting in a house that had waited decades for someone to love it again. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the will reading that had felt like a final rejection, the despair of seeing the house for the first time, the decision to try, even when everyone told me it was impossible, the discovery of the letters, finding Isabella, reconnecting with Marcus, rebuilding not just a house, but an entire family. It had been the hardest year of my life, and also the best. I had started with nothing but a wreck and a dream. I had ended with everything that mattered. And I knew, sitting there under the stars, that this was just the beginning. That whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles I would face, I now had the strength and the skills and the love to overcome them. Because I had learned the most important lesson of all, that we are all just houses in a way. We all have cracks in our foundations and holes in our roofs and rooms that need repair. But we are never beyond saving. We are never too broken to be beautiful again. We just need someone to believe in us. We just need to believe in ourselves. And then, piece by piece, board by board, nail by nail, we can rebuild. We can always rebuild. That's what I found when I started fixing up that wreck of a house my parents left me. Not just a home, not just a family, but the person I was always meant to be. And for that, I will be grateful every single day for the rest of my life. The following spring, I made another decision. I quit my job at the kindergarten. Not because I didn't love teaching, but because I had discovered something new about myself, something I never would have found if I hadn't been forced to renovate that house. I loved working with my hands. I loved taking something broken and making it whole again. I loved the satisfaction of looking at a finished project and knowing that I had created it, that it existed because of my effort and my skill. Rosa had been encouraging me for months. Rosa said, "Elena, you have a gift for this. I've trained a lot of people over the years, and most of them just want to get the job done. But you understand the soul of it. You understand that a house is more than just walls and roof. It's a living thing." I said, "I don't know if I could do this as a career. Teaching is stable, safe." Rosa said, "Safe?" You just spent a year rebuilding a house from nothing on a kindergarten teacher's salary. You think that was safe? She had a point. I talked to Isabella about it one evening, sitting in the garden we had planted together, watching the sun set behind the trees. Isabella said, "What's holding you back?" I said, "Fear, I guess. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough?" She laughed. She said, "Elena, you literally rebuilt an entire house, by yourself, with no experience, and you're worried about not being good enough?" I said, "That was different." She said, "How? How was that different?" I didn't have an answer. Isabella said, "Listen, I spent years afraid to reach out to our father's family, years convinced that you would all reject me, that I would be hurt again. And then I got your letter, and I took a chance, and look where we are now. Sometimes fear is just a wall we build in our own minds, and you already know how to tear down walls." I smiled at that. I said, "When did you get so wise?" She said, "I had a good teacher, a sister who showed me what courage looks like. So I did it. I talked to Rosa about partnering with her, and she was thrilled. We called our company Second Chances Renovation, and our specialty was exactly what it sounded like, taking houses that everyone else had given up on and bringing them back to life. Our first official project was a Victorian in the next town over, a beautiful old lady of a house that had been abandoned for 20 years. The owners, a young couple named David and Patricia, had bought it for almost nothing because everyone told them it was a lost cause. Patricia said, "Everyone thinks we're crazy. Our parents, our friends, even the real estate agent who sold it to us." He kept trying to talk us out of it. I looked at the house, at its sagging porches and broken windows and paint peeling off in long strips, and I smiled. I said, "I know the feeling, but trust me, this house has good bones. She just needs someone to believe in her." We spent 6 months on that project. It was hard work, harder than my own house in some ways, because I was responsible for someone else's dream now, not just my own, but it was also incredibly rewarding. Watching that house transform, seeing the joy on David and Patricia's faces as each room came back to life, it filled something in me that teaching never had. Not that teaching wasn't important. It was. But this was something different. This was art. This was creation. This was taking the broken pieces of the world and putting them back together. We finished the Victorian in late September, just in time for David and Patricia to move in before their first baby arrived. At the final walkthrough, Patricia was crying. Patricia said, "I never thought it would look like this. I never imagined it could be so beautiful." I said, "It was always beautiful. It just needed someone to see it." She hugged me, her pregnant belly making it awkward but no less heartfelt. She said, "Thank you. Thank you for believing in us when no one else did." After they left, Rosa and I stood on the porch of the finished house, looking at our work. Rosa said, "You know, when you first came to me with that disaster on Willow Creek Road, I thought you were delusional. A kindergarten teacher with no experience wanting to rebuild a house that should have been condemned. I only agreed to help because I admired your stubbornness," I said. "And now?" she said. "Now I think you were exactly what this business needed. Fresh eyes, new ideas, and more determination than anyone I've ever met." I said, "I learned from the best." She said, "Damn right you did." We laughed together, and I felt a warmth spread through me. This was my life now. This was who I had become. Not the overlooked daughter, not the lesser sibling, not the woman who couldn't do anything right. I was Elena Fletcher, co-owner of Second Chances Renovation. I was a woman who took broken things and made them whole. I was someone who believed in possibilities that others couldn't see. And it all started with a wreck of a house and a father's final, complicated gift. Word spread about our work, and soon we had more projects than we could handle. We hired 2 assistants, then 3 more. We expanded into commercial renovations, restoring old storefronts and community buildings that had been abandoned for years. But my favorite projects were always the houses, the ones that other contractors walked away from, the ones that seemed beyond saving. Because I knew better now. I knew that nothing was beyond saving if you were willing to put in the work. Two years after I started the company, we got a call about a property on the edge of town. An old farmhouse, built in the 1870s, that had been empty for 40 years. The family who owned it had let it fall into disrepair, and now they wanted to sell but couldn't find a buyer, because the house was in such bad shape. I drove out to see it alone, just like I had driven out to see Willow Creek Road all those years ago. And just like then, my heart sank when I first saw it. This house was worse. Much worse. Parts of it had collapsed entirely. The barn next to it was nothing but a pile of rotting wood. The fields around it were overgrown with weeds higher than my head. But something made me walk closer. Something made me push through the broken front door and step inside. And that's when I saw it. The original staircase, a masterpiece of 19th century craftsmanship, still standing despite everything. Hand-carved banisters, intricate newel posts, details that you couldn't find anymore, that would cost a fortune to replicate. The family who owned the property met me later that day. They were 3 siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, all in their 60s, all clearly at odds with each other about what to do. The oldest brother, a man named George, spoke first. George said, "We just want to be rid of it. Our parents let it go to ruin, and none of us have the money or the interest to fix it. We'll take any reasonable offer." The sister Margaret shook her head. Margaret said, "It's our family history. 4 generations grew up in that house. I hate to see it torn down." The younger brother William said, "It's already tearing itself down. Might as well finish the job and sell the land. They argued among themselves while I stood there thinking. Finally, I spoke up. I said, "What if I made you an offer for the house and the land? And what if I promised to restore it, to bring it back to what it used to be?" They all stopped and looked at me. Margaret said, "You think you can save it?" I said, "I think I can try. I've saved houses that looked worse." George said, "And what would you do with it?" I thought about it. I hadn't planned this far ahead. But suddenly, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I said, "I want to turn it into a place where families can come together, a place for reunions, for celebrations, for healing old wounds, a place where people can find each other again." Margaret's eyes were filling with tears. Margaret said, "That's exactly what this house used to be, before everything fell apart." I said, "Then let me bring it back." The renovation took 3 years. It was the biggest project I had ever undertaken, and there were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if I had bitten off more than I could chew. But every time I felt like giving up, I would think about that first house on Willow Creek Road. I would think about Isabella and Marcus and all the broken pieces of my family that we had managed to put back together. I would think about what Rosa had told me all those years ago. Every old house has stories to tell. You just have to be patient enough to listen. The farmhouse had stories. I found them in the walls as we stripped away the damaged plaster. Old letters hidden behind a brick. A child's drawing tucked into a gap in the floorboards. A wedding photo from 1922. The glass cracked, but the faces still visible. I tracked down the family members who had left those artifacts behind. Most of them were gone now, but their children and grandchildren were still alive. I returned what I found to them, and in exchange, they shared their memories of the house, their stories of holidays and summers, and ordinary days that had become precious with time. George and Margaret and William started coming by to see the progress. At first, they stayed separate, barely speaking to each other, but as the house began to take shape, something changed. They started arriving at the same time. They started walking through the rooms together, pointing out where their bedrooms had been, where their grandmother's rocking chair used to sit, where their father had proposed to their mother. By the time the house was finished, they were talking again. Really talking, for the first time in decades. The conflicts that had driven them apart seemed smaller somehow, less important than the shared history they had nearly lost. I held the grand opening on a summer evening, with the setting sun painting the restored farmhouse in shades of gold and rose. George and Margaret and William were there, along with their children and grandchildren. Rosa was there, and Delia, and Isabella, and Marcus with his family. I stood on the porch of the farmhouse, looking out at all the people gathered in the garden, and I gave a speech. I said, 5 years ago, I inherited a wreck of a house from my father. Everyone told me it was worthless, that I should tear it down and move on. But I didn't listen. I believed that if something had been loved once, it could be loved again. I believed that broken things could be healed. I paused, looking at Isabella, who was smiling at me with tears in her eyes. I said, what I didn't know then was that I wasn't just saving a house. I was saving myself. I was saving my family. I was learning that the things we think are curses are sometimes blessings in disguise, that the hardest challenges can lead us to our greatest joys. I gestured to the farmhouse behind me. I said, this house taught me the same lesson. It showed me that families can find their way back to each other, that history doesn't have to be lost. that with enough love and enough work, we can rebuild almost anything. George stepped forward. He said, "I want to say something, if that's okay." I nodded. George said, "When Elena first told us she wanted to restore this house, I thought she was crazy. I'd written this place off years ago, just like I'd written off my brother and sister. We'd let our differences drive us apart, just like we'd let this house fall apart. But watching Elena work, watching her believe in something that seemed hopeless, it made me realize something. If she could save this house, maybe we could save our family. Maybe it wasn't too late." He looked at Margaret and William and his voice cracked. George said, "I'm sorry. For all the years we wasted. For all the things I said. I'm sorry." Margaret took his hand. William put a hand on his shoulder. And they stood there together, 3 siblings reunited, in front of a house that their family had built 150 years ago. That night, after everyone else had gone home, I walked through the farmhouse one more time. The floors gleamed. The windows sparkled. The old staircase that had first caught my attention had been restored to its original glory, each hand-carved detail preserved and protected. I climbed those stairs to the second floor and found my favorite room, a small bedroom that faced east, where the morning sun would pour through the windows. I had renovated this room myself, every board and every nail, and it felt like mine somehow, even though it belonged to the world now. I sat on the window seat and looked out at the stars, and I thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. A father's will that had seemed like a final rejection. A house that had looked like a curse. A decision to try, even when everyone told me I would fail. And now here I was, running a successful business, connected to a sister I loved, reconciled with a brother I had barely known, surrounded by a community of people who believed in second chances, in restoration, in the power of love to heal old wounds. I was 40 years old. I had spent the first 34 years of my life feeling like I wasn't enough, like I was always falling short, like I would never measure up to the standards that others had set for me. But the last 6 years had taught me something different. They had taught me that the only standards that matter are the ones we set for ourselves. That our worth isn't determined by what we inherit or what others think of us, but by what we choose to do with what we're given. My father had given me a wreck of a house and $12,000. My brother had gotten a mansion and $400,000. But I had gotten so much more than Marcus could ever understand. I had gotten a purpose, a passion, a path to becoming the person I was always meant to be. And I had gotten a family, a real family. Not the dysfunctional, competitive, silent one I had grown up with, but one built on honesty and forgiveness, and the willingness to do the hard work of loving each other. That's what I found when I started fixing up that wreck of a house. Not the thing I expected, not the thing I wanted, but exactly the thing I needed. And I wouldn't trade it for all the mansions in the world. The next morning, I drove back to Willow Creek Road, to the little house where it all began. Isabella was there, making breakfast in the kitchen we had renovated together. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air. Isabella said, "How was the opening last night?" I said, "Perfect." "Better than perfect." She smiled. She said, "I saw the photos. The house looks amazing." I said, "It does. But you know what's funny? This house is still my favorite." This little house on Willow Creek Road where everything started. Isabella said, "Mine too." We sat together at the kitchen table, eating breakfast and talking about nothing important. 2 sisters who had found each other in the most unlikely way. Through the window, I could see the garden in full bloom, the roses and lavender and herbs that Maria Santos had planted so many years ago. that we had brought back to life. This house had been loved once. Then it had been forgotten. Then it had been found again. Just like Isabella. Just like me. And now it would be loved for as long as we lived, a testament to the power of persistence, the strength of family, and the simple truth that nothing is ever truly beyond repair. You just have to be willing to try. You just have to believe. And then, piece by piece, day by day, you can rebuild anything, even yourself, especially yourself. That's the story of how a wreck of a house became the greatest gift I ever received. That's the story of how I found my sister, my purpose, and my true self. That's the story of how everything broken can become beautiful again. And it's not really an ending. It's just the beginning. 6 months after the farmhouse opened, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from a television producer named Rebecca Torres, who worked for a home renovation network. Rebecca said, "Elena, I've been hearing about your work for over a year now. The farmhouse restoration made the news, and I've been following your company ever since. I'd like to talk to you about a potential television show." I almost laughed. I said, "A television show?" "About me?" Rebecca said. "About you and your company. About the philosophy behind what you do. We'd call it second chances, just like your business. Each episode would follow you as you restore a house that everyone else has given up on. But it would be about more than just the renovation. It would be about the stories behind the houses, the families connected to them, the healing that happens when we save something that seemed lost." I was speechless. Rebecca said, "I've read your story, Elena. The Inheritance, the house on Willow Creek Road, finding your sister. It's exactly the kind of narrative that resonates with people. Real stories about real transformation. Would you at least meet with me to discuss it?" I met with her the following week. She flew out to Millbrook and I gave her a tour of the farmhouse, then the Victorian we had restored, then finally the little house on Willow Creek Road where it all began. As we walked through my original project, Rebecca was quiet, taking everything in. Finally, she said, "You really did all this yourself?" "With no experience?" I said. "Rosa taught me most of it, but yes, I was the one swinging the hammer, laying the tile, sanding the floors." Rebecca said, "Why? You could have hired people. You could have just supervised." I thought about her question. It was the same question Delia had asked me years ago, sitting on the bathroom floor while I struggled with tile. I said, "Because I needed to prove something to myself. My whole life, people had told me what I couldn't do. My father, my brother, my ex-husband. They saw me as fragile, incapable, not worth betting on. Working on this house, feeling the blisters on my hands and the ache in my muscles, watching something beautiful emerge from something broken. That was how I learned to believe in myself. That was how I became who I am." Rebecca was nodding. She said, "That's exactly what I want the show to capture. Not just the physical transformation of the houses, but the emotional transformation of the people involved. The homeowners, the families, and you, your journey." I said, "Can I think about it?" She said, "Of course. Take all the time you need." I talked to Isabella that night. She had moved into the house on Willow Creek Road permanently now, and I stayed there most weekends, even though I had my own apartment in the city closer to the office. Isabella said, "A television show, that's incredible." I said, "It's terrifying. Having cameras follow me around, having millions of people watch me work. What if I fail?" Isabella looked at me with that knowing expression she had developed over the years we had known each other. She said, "Elena, you've already faced your biggest fears. You took on a house that should have been condemned. You reached out to a sister who had every reason to reject you. You rebuilt relationships that had been broken for years. What's a television camera compared to all that?" I said, "When you put it that way, it does sound less scary." She said, "Besides, think about all the people you could reach. All the people out there who feel like failures, who feel like they can't do anything right, who need to hear that it's possible to start over. You could show them what you showed me. That nothing is beyond repair." I called Rebecca the next day and told her I was interested. The show took another year to develop. There were meetings and contracts and pilot episodes and more meetings. But finally, 3 years after I inherited the house on Willow Creek Road, the first episode of Second Chances aired on national television. I watched it with Isabella and Marcus and Rosa and Delia, all of us crowded into the living room of the little house where it all began. It was surreal, seeing my face on the screen, hearing my voice narrate the story of a house we had saved in the first episode. When it was over, everyone was quiet for a moment. Then Delia said, "Well, that was something." Marcus said, "I never thought I'd see my little sister on television." I said, "Neither did I." Isabella squeezed my hand. She said, "Mom would be so proud." I looked at her, surprised. She rarely talked about Maria in front of Marcus, still uncertain of her place in our complicated family history. But Marcus spoke up. He said, "She's right. Both our mothers would be proud. You've done something amazing, Elena, something none of us could have imagined." I felt tears pricking at my eyes. I said, "I couldn't have done it without all of you. Without Rosa teaching me how to hold a hammer. Without Delia bringing me food when I was too exhausted to cook. Without Isabella giving me a reason to keep going when I wanted to give up. Without you, Marcus, finally seeing me as an equal." Marcus said, "I always saw you, Elena. I was just too arrogant to admit it." The show was a hit. Not a massive blockbuster hit, but enough of one that we got renewed for a second season, then a third. Each episode told the story of a house that seemed beyond saving, and the family connected to it. A grandmother's cottage where 5 generations had lived, now falling apart. A church that had been the center of a community, abandoned for decades. A row of workers' houses from the 1800s, scheduled for demolition until we stepped in. But the stories that resonated most were the personal ones. The episode where Marcus appeared, talking about how watching me work on the house had forced him to confront his own failures as a brother. The episode where Isabella told her story, the years in foster care, the search for family, the healing that came when she finally found where she belonged. The episode that made me cry was the one about Rosa. We had kept her mostly behind the scenes in the early episodes, but the producers finally convinced her to step into the spotlight. She told her own story, how she had started her business 25 years ago when women in construction were rare and disrespected. How she had built her reputation one house at a time, proving herself over and over again. Rosa said, "When Elena came to me with that disaster on Willow Creek Road, I saw myself in her. Young, stubborn, determined to prove everyone wrong. I knew she was going to succeed because she didn't know how to quit. People like that, you can't stop them. You can only get out of their way or get on board." I hugged her after the filming ended. I said, "You never told me you saw yourself in me." Rosa said, "Some things you don't need to say out loud. You just show them." The show ran for 5 seasons. By the end, Second Chances Renovation had projects in 12 states. We had trained hundreds of people, many of them like me, people who had been told they couldn't, who had been underestimated and overlooked. But I never forgot where it started. The little house on Willow Creek Road remained my home base, the place I returned to whenever I needed to remember who I was and why I did this work. Isabella and I had officially shared ownership of the house for years by then. She lived there full-time, running her foster youth nonprofit from a small office we had added to the back. I stayed there on weekends and holidays, in the guest room I had created with my own hands all those years ago. The garden Maria Santos had planted was legendary now. People drove from neighboring towns just to see it. We had added to it over the years, creating pathways and seating areas, and a small pond where we released the goldfish that Marcus's kids won at the county fair one summer. On the 10th anniversary of the day I first saw the house, Isabella and I held a party. Everyone was there. Rosa, retired now but still sharp as ever. Delia, married with twins who called me Aunt Elena. Marcus and his wife and their kids, who were teenagers now and thought their parents were hopelessly embarrassing. Frank from next door, 92 years old but still spry enough to tell stories about the old days. And new friends, too. David and Patricia, the couple whose Victorian we had restored, with their 3 children. George and Margaret and William from the farmhouse, their feud long forgotten. Dozens of homeowners whose houses we had saved over the years. I stood on the porch I had rebuilt with my own hands, and looked out at all those faces. I thought about my father, about the will that had seemed so cruel, so unfair, about the mystery of why he had kept this house for 30 years, why he had left it to me instead of selling it off. I would never know his reasons for certain. He had taken them to his grave. But I had come to believe that somewhere, deep down, he had known. He had known that Marcus, for all his success, didn't need another challenge. He had known that I, for all my apparent limitations, had strength he had never recognized. Maybe it was his apology, his way of saying he was wrong about me without ever having to admit it out loud. Or maybe it was just luck. Maybe the universe had intervened where my father had failed. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what I had built from the ruins. What mattered was the family I had found and created. What mattered was the person I had become. Isabella came to stand beside me. Isabella said, "What are you thinking about?" I said, "Everything. Nothing. The way life works out in ways you never expect." She nodded. She said, 10 years ago, I was alone in Portland, convinced I would never have a real family. Now look at us." I put my arm around her. I said, "We did okay, didn't we?" She said, "We did more than okay." We stood there together, watching our friends and family laugh and talk and celebrate, and I felt a peace I had never known before. The house stood solid behind us, its walls holding stories old and new, its foundation as strong as the day it was built 100 years ago. It had been abandoned. It had been broken. It had been written off as worthless. But it had been wrong about what it was worth. We had all been wrong. Because the value of a house, like the value of a person, isn't determined by its condition in any given moment. It's determined by what it can become, what it can be if someone is willing to do the work. My father left me a wreck of a house, and my brother got the mansion. Everyone thought I got the short end of the deal. But they were wrong. So wrong. Because what I found in that wreck, what I built from those ruins, was worth more than any mansion could ever be. I found my sister. I found my purpose. I found my strength. I found my family. I found myself. And I found home. Real home. The kind that has nothing to do with walls and everything to do with love. That's my story. That's what I found when I started fixing up that wreck of a house my parents left me. And if there's one thing I want you to take from it, it's this. Whatever wreck you're facing in your own life, whatever broken thing you think is beyond repair, don't give up. Pick up a hammer. Start somewhere. Believe that beauty can come from ruins. Because it can. It really, truly can. I'm living proof. And so is this house. And so is my family. And so, maybe, are you. You just have to be willing to try. That's the secret. That's what nobody tells you when you're standing in front of something that seems impossible. They don't tell you that the trying itself is what changes you, that the struggle is where the growth happens, that every failure is just a lesson in disguise. I think about the young woman I was 10 years ago, the one who cried in her car outside that ruined house, the one who felt like a failure, like an afterthought, like someone who would never amount to anything. I wish I could go back and tell her what I know now. I would say, "Elena, you are so much stronger than you realize. You have so much love to give and so much capacity for growth. The people who underestimate you are wrong. The voice in your head that says you can't is wrong. You are about to embark on the greatest adventure of your life, and it starts with a broken house and a stubborn refusal to give up. I would say, the sister you never knew you had is out there waiting for you. The brother you thought was lost to arrogance will become one of your closest allies. The skills you think you don't have are just waiting to be discovered. The person you're meant to become is already inside you, hidden like those letters were hidden under the floorboards, just waiting to be found. I would say, trust the process. Trust yourself. And when it gets hard, when you want to quit, when everyone tells you it's impossible, remember that they said the same thing about this house. And look what it became. Look what you became. But I can't go back. None of us can. We can only go forward, carrying the lessons we've learned, sharing them with others who might need to hear them. That's why I tell this story. Not to brag about what I accomplished, but to show what's possible. To show that the starting point doesn't determine the destination. That the inheritance you receive, whether it's a mansion or a wreck, matters less than what you choose to do with it. My brother Marcus got the mansion. He still lives there, actually. It's a beautiful house, well-maintained, filled with expensive furniture and artwork. But he told me once, a few years after our reconciliation, that it never felt like home. Marcus said, I walk through those rooms and I just see Dad. I see all the expectations he had for me, all the ways I tried to live up to them. I became a lawyer because he wanted me to. I married the woman he approved of. I raised my kids the way he thought they should be raised, and none of it made me happy. I said, what would have made you happy? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I wanted to be a teacher. Can you believe that? When I was in college, before Dad convinced me that law was the only respectable profession, I wanted to teach high school history. I wanted to help kids understand where we came from so they could build something better. I said, it's not too late. He laughed sadly. He said, I'm 52 years old with a mortgage and kids in college. It's definitely too late. I said, Marcus, I was 34 when I started over. I had no skills, no experience, no idea what I was doing. And look where I am now. It's never too late. He looked at me with something I had never seen in his eyes before. Hope. A year later, Marcus retired from the law firm. He went back to school, got his teaching certification, and now he teaches American history at the high school in Millbrook. He says it's the happiest he's ever been. The mansion was sold. Marcus and his wife bought a modest house closer to the school, and they donated a significant portion of the proceeds to Isabella's nonprofit for foster youth. Marcus said, it should have been hers all along. This is just me finally doing what Dad should have done decades ago. Isabella used the money to expand her programs, reaching hundreds more kids each year. She developed a mentorship initiative pairing former foster youth with caring adults, and a life skills program teaching everything from cooking to budgeting to job interview techniques. Isabella said, every kid deserves a chance. Every kid deserves someone who believes in them. That's what Elena taught me. That's what this family has shown me. And now I get to pass it on. Sometimes, when I'm working on a particularly difficult project, when I'm elbow deep in plaster dust or struggling with a stubborn piece of trim, I think about how strange life is, how the worst moments can lead to the best ones, how pain can be transformed into purpose. I think about Maria Santos, the woman I never met but who connects me to my sister. The woman who loved my father despite everything, who raised Isabella with grace and courage, who planted a garden that still blooms every spring. I think about my mother, who died without knowing about Isabella, who might have been hurt or might have understood, who I'll never be able to ask. I think about my father, that complicated man who was capable of both abandonment and, in his own flawed way, love, who left me a burden that became a blessing, who trusted me to fix what he couldn't fix himself. I don't have all the answers. I don't know why things happened the way they did. I don't know if there's a grand plan or if we're all just stumbling through, making the best of the circumstances we're given. But I know this. When I started fixing up that wreck of a house, I thought I was just doing repairs. I was wrong. I was building a life. I was building a family. I was building a future that I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams. And that's something no one can ever take away from me. Not my father's ghost, not my own doubts, not anyone who ever told me I couldn't. Because I did. I did it. And so can you. Whatever your wreck is, whatever broken thing is waiting for you to find it, don't be afraid. Pick up your hammer, roll up your sleeves, start with the first nail, the first board, the first small step. And trust that if you keep going, if you refuse to give up, if you believe in the possibility of transformation, something beautiful will emerge. Something you never expected. Something that will change your life forever. That's the promise of every broken thing. That's the hope in every ruin. That's what I found when I started fixing up that wreck of a house my parents left me. And it was worth everything. Every tear, every blister, every moment of doubt. It was all worth it. Because on the other side of the struggle was everything I ever wanted. A home, a family, a purpose, and a self I could finally be proud of. That's my story, and now it's part of yours too. So go, find your wreck, and start building.